today, and let me start by providing a few background information for those of you who are joining us for the first time today. Today's webinar is part of a webinar series that we've prepared leading up to the Global Conference on Cyberspace, which will take place in The Hague in April of this year. It's supposed to provide an overview of different topics relating to cybersecurity, and this is the third webinar following the first webinar, which was the general overview of cybersecurity and human rights, and the second webinar, which focused on the technology underlying this policy debate. Each webinar consists of a 20 to 30-minute presentation, followed by Q&A, and you should feel free to ask questions during the presentation itself using the Q&A window at the top right corner of your screen. To provide a little framing of how we are thinking about cybersecurity, we are using the definition that was developed by the Freedom Online Coalition Cybersecurity Working Group in Internet Free and Secure that started to approach this topic first by stating that international human rights law and international humanitarian law apply online as well as offline, and that cybersecurity must protect technological innovation and the exercise of human rights. The definition that the working group developed is as follows. Cybersecurity is the preservation through policy, technology, and education of the availability, confidentiality, and integrity of information and its underlying infrastructure so as to preserve the security of persons both online and offline. This definition is based on the ISO 27000 standard. And if you look at the agenda of the webinars and its structure, which is available on the website that you will see in the chat, the way that the webinar series is structured is following the agenda of the Global Conference on Cyberspace. So the different individual webinars mirror specific topics and the plenary sessions of the conference itself. So with these few introductory remarks, let me now introduce Miriam Dankevelty, who you see on your screens. And Dr. Miriam Dankevelty is head of the New Risk Research Unit at the Center for Security Studies at the ETH Zurich, Switzerland, and was a fellow at the Stiftung Neue Verantwortung in Berlin, Germany. Miriam has written about this topic for many years and has authored several books and articles on information age security issues. I'm very happy that she was able to join us today, and she will be leading this webinar, which focuses on the roles and responsibilities of different actors. After Miriam is done with her presentation, I will jump back in and will read your questions out loud for Miriam to answer. So please make sure that you share your questions that you might have during the presentation and afterwards during the Q&A using the Q&A window as part of the platform. And with that, over to you, Miriam.
Thank you very much, Tim. Hi, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here online and speak to you about roles and responsibilities of different actors in cybersecurity. I do hope that I can keep to the 30 minutes given. As an academic, I love to talk a lot, but I'll do my very best. You should see my presentation. You should see my face speaking. And as Tim has pointed out, you can post your questions anytime. We will collect them, and I will try to answer as many of them as I can after the presentation. Okay, here is what we want to do, or the key questions that I would like to address in my webinar. What type of actors have traditionally had what kind of roles and responsibilities in cybersecurity? And you see that there is a slight historical dimension here that is important, because we have seen that the expectations and the roles have actually changed over the years, and that's an important aspect of this whole topic. We would then like to look at the problems that we encounter from a human rights perspective, given this tension between, security ideas. And at the very end, I would like to give you a few ideas of how civil society should or could get involved in this important topic. That's the key questions. And the aims are that we get a better understanding of different expectations and positions in the whole debate, so that we should be able to find or better identify potential common grounds between different actors, because that's always been one of the major difficulties in multi-stakeholder processes. And we should also, as I already pointed out, kind of see the main problems arising from these different expectations, roles, responsibilities, so that we could, moving forward, design optimal strategies for civil society input. The structure will be as follows. I will give you a short history of cybersecurity policy concerns, because the roles and responsibilities are actually nicely seen there, and also the change that I already alluded to. Then I would like to speak about the main actors. There's several: the state, obviously, the private sector, businesses, and citizens. Obviously, all of these categories are not just one black box. We will look inside those categories, because the diversity within the different categories is part of the problem. I will then focus on two main issues at the interface between these different actor groups. One is between the state and the private sector, where it's about public-private partnerships and critical infrastructure protection, and the other is the state-citizen relationship, and there we'll mainly focus on surveillance, or rather on that tension that I mentioned between security and liberties. And the fourth point, the shortest, is the way forward. And I hope we will be able to discuss potentially other points that you see that come from my presentation. As mentioned, I would like to start with a short history of cybersecurity policy concerns, and I hope you'll see why. If you look at the policy dynamics, it's obviously not a new issue. The whole cybersecurity issue wasn't called cybersecurity in the 80s. It was called information security, or it was called information warfare, or similar things, but fundamentally it was about very similar issues. Back in the early 80s, hacking as a potential threat came to the attention of the policy community. And what you did see is that cybercrime in particular was interlinked with foreign intrusion espionage topics, and that already elevated it to a national security issue. So the ability of foreign criminal elements to steal relevant data was an issue back then already. As I mentioned, the main concern was prevention of damaging disclosures of classified information. But if you look at the problem at that time and compare it to nowadays, it was much more limited than what we have now. And not a mass phenomenon in the sense that the computers that were accessible through the then internet, just so few in numbers. Businesses were coming online, but still it was a containable problem, a small problem. If you look at the main actors, it's government actors, mainly law enforcement, and interestingly enough, the tech community, which obviously plays a role throughout Bulgaria's history. Now, the dynamics that set in the 1990s are still the ones that we are basically seeing now, but it's important to understand what happened. So first of all, the internet was commercialized. That is well known, but the implications, also the security implications of these, are quite important. So the networking aspect was very important, and if we then link it to the big topic, critical infrastructures, it becomes even more important. You also have a quantitative increase in cyber incidents that are, shown by statistics. This is the time where you, for the first time, actually have different institutions coming forward with statistics proving that the problem is getting bigger and bigger and more expensive and more expensive. Also important for the whole security complex is the involvement of the military. I just listed one element, so it started before the Gulf War of 1991, but that was an important watershed moment during which mainly the US military started to develop information warfare ideas and doctrine for how to fight war in cyberspace and through cyber means. The most important aspect, though, and I understand that one of the webinars last week also addressed critical infrastructures quite fundamentally, is that critical infrastructures became the main focal point of the whole debate, and cyber infrastructures are usually part of critical infrastructure. So what we see is that, the information revolution leads to novel vulnerabilities. First of all, the commercialization of the whole internet doesn't really lead to a lot of security, and you have interconnection between different aspects of critical infrastructures now that actually also up the vulnerability considerably. In the policy debate, you also have discussions about the capabilities of new malicious actors, buzzword being cyber terror at the time. But this is also linked to an overall trend in security politics, and I'll come to that. The idea that vulnerabilities are exploited by usually non-state actors that you can't really grapple with the normal tools that you had during the Cold War. And that's once again linked to the commercialization aspect, but also to the more economic aspects of cybersecurity. Liberalization, started much earlier, but a lot of the critical infrastructures that were considered fundamentally important for national security moved away out of the hands of the state. And we'll come to what that actually means, for the relationship also between the state and the private sector. At this time, government was still a very strong actor, very much focused on military homeland defense issues, whatever they're called, in different settings, and the private sector. The tech community still plays a role, but in the policy debate, it became a bit secondary. And then, if you look at the 2000s and the 2010s, in which we are, you see more of the same, in the sense that you have statistics that prove, that we have more, better, more dangerous attacks, so the quantity goes up, the quality goes up. I think there's also much more attention on attacks in the media, but in policy circles, and I just listed a few examples of really well-known malware, Stuxnet, Flame, or also recent mega hacks, the Target hack, the Sony hack. These are all things that have become very prominent in our minds, but also in policymakers' minds. Another interesting aspect that you see that also, brings forth this national security dimension so much is targeted attacks. First of all, non-state actors, hacktivists, that very, particularly attack high-level targets to humiliate them. Organized crime becoming much more sophisticated, creating much more damage. Also a link between, organized crime and state actors, and very clearly state actors that become much more active in offensive operations in cyberspace. Advanced persistent threats, are commonly seen as proof that states, many different states actually, are building up cyber capabilities. And what that leads to is what some people have called the cyber arms race. Whether that's the right term or not, we don't have time to discuss that. But basically it means that many people feel insecure, many states feel insecure and start building up their own capabilities. And in the dynamics that we have in the international arena, this leads to what we call increased securitization. So many different aspects of cyber issues become securitized, become considered a national security issue. And that has great implications for roles and responsibilities. And that's where we are now, basically, in a time where security trumps many other things. I'll come to the second part of my presentation about the main actors. Now, as I said, we're going to look at three groups. Now, if you look at the self-assigned, but also, sometimes other people assign roles and responsibilities to these actors, I would say we can differentiate between the following. For the state, we do have a responsibility to protect its own assets, for example, government functions. The state owns, infrastructures or networks that, are theirs. So they need to be able to protect them or secure them. But, and that's very important, the state traditionally also has a responsibility to provide security and safety for its society, and I'll come to that. Now, for the private sector, there is a responsibility, once again, to protect its own assets. So normally for a bank, it is important that they protect their own networks so that they know how to actually get, online banking secure so that we can do online banking. That's not a state responsibility normally. But there's an interesting line between, what is just an asset of a bank and when does it become, once again, a national issue or a national security issue, and that's when we move into the domain of critical infrastructures again. So another responsibility of the private sector from the viewpoint of the state is that they should be part of that protection, that they should provide part of the security for critical infrastructures, or even, more than a part. And that's, in different states, that's seen differently and discussed differently. Now, societies, it's a hard category to talk about because very often they're not even included in discussions about roles and responsibilities in cybersecurity. But when you look at policy documents and, what we could see there, what is expected, you see that once again, there is a responsibility of the individual, but then, society as a collective to protect their own assets. That would be my home computer. That's my responsibility. And the idea behind it is always, that you need as many secure machines as possible to become, somewhat cyber secure in a nation or globally. Further, there is an idea that society should be aware of the risk. So there's this element of, they should know that there's a risk, and that's where some programs come in to educate, or awareness-raising programs. Plus, you should be a good cyber citizen, so you should know how to actually, behave online, what is allowed, what is not allowed, etc. But when you look at all these three different things, you see that the security ideas behind these are largely different. For example, for a private sector actor, to be secure so that they can do online banking is completely different than when the state says, well, the financial sector needs to be cyber secure. So there's always gaps in between these different ideas of what different stakeholders should do. Now, I would like to look at some of the, as I said, problems, but also the diversity within these different groups. Now, the state has a fundamental dilemma, and we need to start with the state because we are fundamentally looking at the security issue, and, in security, the state remains very important. Now, from the state perspective, it has a big problem that its power to resist vulnerability plus the power to actually exploit vulnerabilities disappears downwards. It goes, to individuals, for example, upwards to transnational network threats or supranational organizations, and sideways, privatization. So the locale of power is moving from the state hands into different directions. That basically means that they can no longer, as we say, go it alone. They need private actors. Now, first of all, they have become the ones that threaten the security of cyberspace, but they are also the ones that are directly threatened when they're critical infrastructure owners or just normal businesses out there, or, just normal citizens that become, victims of cybercrime. And non-state actors are therefore needed for definition and enactment of security policy. And I would say that most states in the world have actually realized this. The big problem is obviously how do you get to doing it together. There is another issue that actually hampers states, and is a problem. There is not one state perspective. There is not one government in the world that has, a unity of perspective. You have different communities in there, different bureaucratic units that have sometimes fundamentally different ideas about what security in cyberspace or through cyberspace should look like. So you have law enforcement, you have the intelligence community, you have, more business-oriented entities within government. You have the military, you have civil defense. Depending on where you are, what kind of state you're in, different entities battle for power in this issue. And this is a side note, but it's very interesting because this is a growth market. There is still money to be had. So a lot of, power politics happen in the sense that these different units want to position themselves as the most important so that they get more responsibility and resources. And that sometimes leads to, I would say, a hype in the whole discussion, because if you say, well, it's not a problem, you'll not get the money. Moving on to companies, we have a similar problem. A company, that private sector doesn't exist. What we can say is that somewhat in all the countries, they're at the forefront of the problem, both because they're the ones exposed to cyber threats daily, depending who they are, what they are, more or less so. But some of them also shape the use of cyberspace considerably. So they're actually, also part of the game of actually setting the whole boundaries. They also directly shape cybersecurity as a landscape, for example, antivirus companies, also by providing statistics and other elements that give us, an idea of what we're actually up against. And I think we can also say there's a lot of power in the hands of a few companies when it comes to cybersecurity issues. I'm not judging that, I'm just stating that as a fact. And as said, it's a very diverse bunch of actors, depending on size, depending on interest, depending on standing, different sectors, as we say. Some are critical infrastructure providers, some are small, medium-sized enterprises, some are really, really large global conglomerates. Some are norms shapers in the sense that, as I said, they shape how we see cyberspace, how we act in cyberspace. And some also earn money from cyber insecurity, which also gives them a very particular role in the whole debate. As for society, we don't have the time to go into a lot of the theories that we have had, let's say in the 90s towards now. But I think I really like this quote by Bruce Schneier, and there's a link to his article at the bottom of this slide. He's a great observer of, the more strategic security aspects of cybersecurity. And I think he really placed it well. If you read this quote, he says, on the one hand, we have traditional organized institutional powers, governments, and large multinational corporations. And then you have the other side of things, the distributed, the more nimble grassroots movements, dissident groups, hackers, criminals, also individuals. Now, in the beginning of the internet debate or cybersecurity debate, there was a lot of talk about how the information revolution actually empowered that second side, that it was a power shift, that the skills revolution empowered society, that, more information gave us more power over government. But now, if we look at what happened in the last few years, this is definitely changing. And he says, the more traditional institutional powers are winning, and they're winning big. And the question is obviously, how the other side can resist this, what the possibilities are. And we'll come to that also. Okay, now if you look at these three actor groups, and you look at the expectations, because I think they also play a role in, when we talk about roles and responsibilities. You see an interesting thing that, each of these actors expects something from the other, but it doesn't really meet, and the security they're after isn't really aligned either. So states mainly expect private companies to help and guarantee national security. The private sector expects to make money, and that's their task, and that's fine, mainly also, from us. So our data is valuable nowadays. And society expects the state to provide security for everyone because that's one of the state functions. And that, once again, leads you, to these tensions that we actually see in this field. I want to take a step away from the tensions to see how state response strategies look like. Because, as I mentioned, it's not a new topic. And, since the later 1990s, states have come up with cybersecurity or critical infrastructure protection policies. And many of them look very similar. And I think you can, once again, kind of look at, the different issues that we have and how this collaboration is supported at. So, on the one hand, you have because I mentioned that the state in itself is not coherent in its strategy. So you have coordination within, the state governments to actually get their different interests aligned. So within the public sector, they want to have more collaboration or centralize it. That differs from country to country. So you have a state, internal aspect to this. And then you have an international dimension, and obviously, the Global Conference on Cybersecurity is also actually part of this international attempt to get a grasp on cybersecurity. I'm not going to go into much detail there, but you will also have a webinar on cybercrime this week. Obviously, a lot of effort goes into making sure that law is harmonized across national boundaries. You also have attempts to build confidence-building measures now, and maybe even go towards something that could be considered arms control. I'm not going to focus on these aspects going forward. I will focus on public-private collaboration, though only briefly because we don't have much time. But that is and has been one of the most important aspects because of, as I said, liberalization and this inability of the state to provide security by and on itself. So they need collaborations. One of the core focal points has been, to actually be able to exchange information about threats and countermeasures. And the idea would be that by knowing more about the threats and what to do and what different actors do and how to make it better, you would be able to enhance the level of security. Recently, the discussion has moved away from voluntary, arrangements, even though they're still mostly voluntary, to the question of should the state regulate in this realm because the necessary security is actually not emerging. So I will talk a bit about public-private collaboration in the next few slides, and I will also talk about the third point, state-society interaction, basically, not so much about public awareness campaigns. They're pretty common in most countries, so that the state has, as I said, this idea that they should, make sure that the society understands that there's a risk and what they should do and where they could go to if they needed to, so whom to call, etc. But there's this other topic that is particularly interesting in, when we look at human rights. That is, the increasing need, security need of the state and what it actually does to society, civil liberties. This is a topic that's obviously going on, way beyond cybersecurity, but I think it has a particularly interesting, aspects in cybersecurity. So if we look at the first, interaction, we see that PPP stands for public-private partnerships, that there's actually a lot of different public-private partnerships. That's also something that many, people are not even aware of. So you see some, I would say that's the majority, on information sharing about incidents and potential countermeasures, as I mentioned. But there's also quite a lot of efforts for early warning public-private partnerships, but also mutual support during incidents, prosecution of attackers, obviously, that doesn't only have to be state-only. Joint funding of R&D, awareness-raising campaigns, are not all done by states themselves, but often in collaboration with private entities or foundations, etc. And quite importantly, actually, joint policy development and strategy building. A lot of effort has gone into, trying to get the view of the private sector into critical infrastructure protection strategies, and the same is happening in cybersecurity to some degrees. What are public-private partnerships? It's quite interesting that this has been, seen as the silver bullet, basically, in the whole debate. You just need public-private partnerships and everything will be okay. Now, obviously, that has not happened. And one part of the problem is that the whole concept has been developed in a completely different context and then adopted uncritically by many governments because it was a catchword, and it did actually, tell us that we need some kind of collaboration between the private and the public sectors. But the problem really is that for security, public-private partnerships need to have very specific functions that they actually are not necessarily designed to do. So you do see that public-private partnerships are wanted by basically all states in the field of cybersecurity, but the exact idea of how to actually do it to get both sides into a beneficial partnership where not just one of the sides is benefited and the other just delivers, is very tricky. And some people have also become quite disillusioned about the whole idea of public-private partnerships, because we've been trying for about 20 years soon, and the success of them is not all that great. There are a few successful ones, but for a majority, they don't deliver what they were actually meant to deliver. And I think we can kind of boil it down to four major problems: hugely diverging interests. Once again, what security is. It's from the viewpoint of a company. Why should they invest more, into security if it just costs them more and the benefit for them is not clearly visible? Trust has been a huge issue. That's in the whole community, that's a problem. But as soon as you want to actually start, engaging with a partner and talk about incidents and, about the innermost secrets of your networks, you need a lot of trust. And that's been one of the also, points for research: how do you get more trust into these relationships? Costs. Big question is, who should bear the cost, the additional costs for security, if a company doesn't want to invest, for whatever reason, more into information security. And as I mentioned, another problem is the voluntary character of the whole arrangement. As soon as it doesn't feel beneficial anymore, it's a time suck, etc., you see that the incentive to actually really participate in them just goes down dramatically. So it's not entirely clear where we are headed from this point, but I have mentioned, and I see that in many different entities, also the European Union. A lot of people are thinking about skipping that voluntary and making it mandatory, certain aspects of it. Now let's turn to state and citizen relationship and the clash of roles and responsibilities there. I think I stole that from the internet. You see that there's some kind of watermark behind it, and unfortunately I didn't remember where I got it from. I just had it in my folder, so I apologize for just stealing content from the internet. But I think this figure shows the relationship really well, and it doesn't only go for cybersecurity, obviously. But there is something called the social contract, and sure, this depends now. This is, the model of a state that functions well, and there is a certain amount of trust between, the society, the people, and the state. But the main idea behind it is that something called society transfers powers onto, what then becomes the state, that actually deals with the inconveniences of the state of nature. So, monopoly of force, making sure that there's a secure national state that, has an executive power, et cetera, et cetera. But in turn, and that is really important, there is a guarantee or a promise in the social contract that the state that gets that power actually provides security and protection for the other side. So, protection of life, of liberty, of property, of basically also a good life in more advanced societies. This is the basic, pillar of why there is a very, important link between society and the state. Now, the problem really is that with incidents, and it doesn't have to be cyber incidents, but it can, this balance between liberties and securities is often, shaken up. And there needs to be a renegotiation between how much liberties and how much security we want. I deliberately present this as, scales and a balance, because we cannot fix the exact level, forever, because notions, of security, liberty change. So there has to be an element of renegotiation possible. But there is also a very important relationship between the two, because you can't have the one without the other. So you can't abolish liberties and still have security. That doesn't work. Or you can't, have no security and just liberty. So they're intricately, they're connected, fundamentally connected. But how much of both there are in a society is, one of the big questions. And obviously, this is highly important for cybersecurity as well. Now, I'm slowly coming to the end, and I just want to kind of take a step back now. Now, the problem really is that, this liberty-security balance is already being shaken up outside the cyber realm. So we used to have a fairly stable world with active potential intention known, but that is gone, so at least in the minds of government. So we are in a time of risks, and the security paradigm has actually changed from defense towards risk prevention, not only but also in many areas. Now, what is the reaction of states when you move, away from a certain area of security? It starts to focus on vulnerabilities, and we talked about vulnerabilities before. And as soon as you have information infrastructures interlinking with critical infrastructures, they're everywhere. There's so many vulnerabilities in today's societies. But that becomes a focus of security policy. And data collection becomes a focus of security policy. Why? Because you don't know anymore. And if you have data, and I'll come to that, you'll collect it because there is a belief that, potentially it might help you fill the gap once again and, get those, at least fill some of these categories again with knowledge. And the problem is also that if you do not know who to target in your data collection, you just potentially target everyone. So what we have is this surveillance dilemma, and this is exactly what we're seeing. So you have data because we have fundamentally insecure technologies, and there's more and more of them, and more, become insecure. And you have increased insecurities in security politics. So what does that lead to? You have immense data collection. If you couple that with, the ability also to collect, plus the ability to store and the ability to analyze, you have exactly what we have today. Let's call it the Snowden era, where we know that everybody is after our data for more security. But there is a fundamental problem that we are actually, headed towards if we believe that this is what is happening. Now, national security considerations now are, outside of cyberspace, but also inside of cyberspace. And it's very hard to actually disconnect the two. Cyberspace has and is increasing in strategic importance. And you have increasing data collection in and through cyberspace due to national security reasons. But the focus, if you now look at what kind of security you want here, is obviously not necessarily and often not on security of individuals. It's a type of national security that's a collective type of national security that is very abstract. And that national security consideration crowds out considerations for the security of the individual citizen. And that also means that the current, system of tensions and roles and responsibilities does not produce security that is relevant to the people. It is to say that creates a problem for human security and human rights. Now, very briefly, what does that mean? Role for civil society, broadly speaking. Now, as soon as we see that there's a massive increase in security needs, securitization, I think we are in an era, where we should have more engagement of civil society because of legitimacy concerns and normative concerns. If security, comes in, national security, the stakes are very high. So it actually calls for more rather than less involvement. And I think what is very important for civil society organizations, groups, is to actually break down those barriers to engagement. That, national security is usually seen as something that is just decided by a few elites, also secretive, etc., but that's exactly the problem. where things go fundamentally wrong, also because the different sides don't necessarily understand each other. So to have more qualitative and actually in the end better processes, it's necessary to really break into these different ways to actually engage. And there is 3 roles, so engaging, transparency and accountability, quite obviously, you know, because the secrecy in this field is not helping a lot. And deepening knowledge in the sense that we need more independent data collection, more independent knowledge also of what is going on in this field. And if we get there, then the legitimacy, sustainability of ongoing processes can be strengthened. We can ensure that, you know, broader normative concerns are attended to. Also that the right technical expertise is leveraged and solutions are being sought. That's often not the case. And ultimately, we're back to, you know, this issue of trust between states and between states and society, but also trust between states, society, and the private sector. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm now taking questions. We probably need a few, you know, moments to organize our Q&A, and you now, you know, if you have questions, please ask them. Thank you.
Anyway, thanks, Miriam, for this excellent presentation. This was really terrific. I have collected a few questions and encourage others to submit additional questions in the Q&A section. Before I start reading them aloud, I just wanted to let everybody know that we are recording this webinar and we'll make it available online on the website. So please note that the questions that I will read out loud will be recorded and will be available later on online. We will not use your name as we read the questions out loud, but the questions you will submit will be part of the recording. So with that, Miriam, let me get started and send you the first question your way. And this question from a participant asks, what role does the private sector have in the human rights debate?
Interesting question. Difficult. I think you do see certain actors like Microsoft, for example, or others, quite actively, you know, engaging with difficult issues that they see. So Microsoft, you know, is developing or is also thinking about norms, so very, you know, traditionally political issues. But I wouldn't say you can talk about the private sector, you know, per se, having a role yet. I think it's very, you know, it really depends whom you're looking at, and it's just a few. So I don't see that it has a huge role. Some companies are getting involved, but the bigger question is, what role should they have? And maybe Tim has an answer to that. Tim, you want to answer as well?
I'm just moderating today, so let me just send you the questions. And the next question that I received is, thank you for the presentation. What are the roles for supranational organizations in allocating and enforcing roles and responsibilities?
What is the role of supranational organizations? Well, I mean, you have the European Union as an important actor that is now trying, you know, to kind of at least make procedures and methodologies and crisis management processes similar in different nation states. And with that comes a certain, you know, idea of roles and responsibilities. But I think most of the roles and responsibilities are actually assigned by states nowadays still, because national cybersecurity is thought nationally first before it's thought internationally. So in a lot of the national cybersecurity strategies, you have a section where it says you need international collaboration, for example, and then, you know, a list of different things. But it's not really, the idea is not really that supranational states will be able to, for example, you know, enforce roles and responsibilities of the private sector in a particular nation. But in terms of, if we think about norms that are developing in the future, I think there could be more of a soft role in actually shaping, you know, good practices. What a good cyber citizen is, also in the sense of private actor, for example.
Thank you, Miriam. The next question is, what recourse do members of the public have to get control of their security since it's in the hands of people they can't trust, for example, government and the private sector?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big issues is that, you know, we often don't even know. So one of the things that we should really try to do is get more awareness of where information is, what is done with information, and that can be done through, you know, various channels. You know, there's different groups in different national contexts that actually take on these issues. Also through legal channels. If we become aware of a practice that seems illegal, that we take legal action, for example. But I think a lot of it is really that awareness issue, the transparency that is lacking. So Edward Snowden has really, you know, opened our eyes to many interconnections also between governments and the private sector that we were not that aware of yet. And it's pretty certain that there's other, you know, issues that we simply don't know yet, also because it's a very dynamic environment that, you know, changes a lot of things. So looking forward into the Internet of Things and also, you know, all those smart appliances, you know, smart fridges, smart toothbrushes, smart cars, smart houses, a lot of data will actually flow, you know, from that might potentially be ours or have implication for how we can, you know, move in the world. And we should just be able to know exactly where the data is going. And we should also be able to know what can be done with it. That's an issue that I think needs to be addressed.
Great, thanks. And to the audience, please feel free to submit your questions if you have any follow-up question to a question that was already asked. So just use the Q&A and we'll make sure that we squeeze this in before we move on to other questions. The next question that I received is, in your model, have you also explored the roles of the technical and academic communities in a collaborative shared approach to cybersecurity?
Thank you. That's a very good point. Actually, when I was making the presentation today, I was aware that I was, you know, excluding an important stakeholder or actor. So I haven't, but it has to be done. I mean, I mentioned the tech community a few times, and it has been very fundamental in also, once again, I mean, not everybody in the tech community, but there's a certain leaning in the tech community, which is, you know, pro free flow of information, etc. So it has often thrown stones into, you know, the machinery of national security, but just tends to say it's national security, hence everybody else shut up. So they have a very, very important role, have always played one, and will in the future, because their security is once again a completely different security from the national security community. For example, if you think IT security, or information assurance type of security, you know, the way that national security is exploiting vulnerabilities, especially the intelligence community, to spy or also to kind of prepare for future, if you want to call it warfare, is obviously fundamentally against, you know, the fundamental principles of information assurance. So there's a very clear clash between those securities. And I think the tech community has a lot of resources, not only knowledge, but also, you know, concepts that can make a lot of sense also, you know, when you think national security as a secure and resilient cyberspace. So they're fundamentally important and should definitely be included also because they know a lot about things work. The academic community is once again very diverse. You know, you have people doing research on technological things. They're very important in the sense that, you know, new cryptographic procedures or new ways of routing information have security aspects immediately. And, you know, the whole dual use topic is very important and is becoming more so when you look at security. But there's obviously others, social scientists. I'm also a social scientist. And they have, you know, a lot of knowledge that sometimes is not yet flowing into the policy processes because they understand concepts, they understand, as I mentioned, for example, bureaucratic politics and what it might lead to in the end, you know, a system that is just not optimal for security. So both of these sub-actors have very important and very you know, specific roles to play, and they should be explored in more detail.
Great, thank you. Before I read you the next question, I received one question that relates to sub-issues being treated as emergency cases. If the participant who submitted that question could elaborate a little bit on that, so I can pose it to Miriam. And also, if you're using acronyms in your question, please make sure not to use acronyms, but to spell out the entire words, so I can read out the question aloud and for everybody to know what this means. So with that, the next question for you, Miriam, is thanks for the presentation. How can we use the rights-based approach in cybersecurity?
I'm not sure I fully understand that question.
Rephrase it. How can we use a rights-based approach in cybersecurity? So how can we use a human rights-based approach when it comes to cybersecurity?
How can we use a human rights-based approach? Well, it can't be the only one. I think the important thing here, or what I try to show, is that actually these 3 factions or 4 or 5 factions need to somewhat find a common ground for, you know, security solutions to emerge. But what I think in terms of human rights and why they're so important is that what many states are not seeing right now is that their way of approaching security is actually lowering, you know, the whole level of security for everybody. So in terms of bringing human rights back in, can become a security issue. So they can, we should try to reframe a lot of the security discussion in terms of making sure that there's an intricate connection between human rights and national security. And if that link is broken, we'll have neither, so we lose double. Does that make sense?
It did to me, so I hope it answers the question. And if not, please send a follow-up question if you have further question about this, for those of you in the audience. The next question is, there are few minimal references to ICTs in the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that's what SDG refers to, being drafted. In your opinion, should specific cyber goals and metrics be included in the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN is currently drafting?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I think, well, goals maybe, but metrics, I find that very tricky. There's just so little, you know, good knowledge that we have in terms of the situation now, in terms of the threats, but also in terms of where we're actually headed. And that's one of the big problems also for, you know, the whole regulation question, because setting, you know, usually setting very clear goals that can be measured comes with fixing a debate in very specific, well, also sometimes shutting down certain other very valid questions. So I'm a bit against fixing it too much. What I do see, though, is that on more national levels, for example, I see that I would see that, you know, a possibility of thinking about levels of security and what it should look like and who should, you know, provide what towards that goal. I think that's much more easily done, because there you could actually think about getting people together to really discuss quite local needs and actually factor them into policy processes. But I think to just think it from the supranational and believe that it will, you know, trickle down, I don't think that can work.
Thanks, Miriam. The next question that I received is, what about the expectations that society has for the private sector and the expectations the private sector has for society? Can you expand on that?
Yeah. So it's actually the one relationship that we really don't have or don't know all that much about. Now, I mentioned that the private sector actually sees society most of the time, sees it as, you know, it's their clients, and we're also used, maybe it's not the right word, but we're also used to gather data, to actually, you know, develop new business procedures, know more about our preferences, etc. So it's a fairly one-way relationship. I think society is not yet all that aware. That kind of goes back to another question that was asked before. A lot of people simply don't care about data and where it goes. And, well, in terms of the security, that's a big problem. So to actually question the role of companies in, you know, the whole game of what data do they collect, what do they force on us, what are our abilities in actually also engaging with that side of the equation and not only think about government. Going forward, I think that will become another very important issue to tackle.
Thank you, Miriam. The next question is, how does what you have been telling us differ when we move away from the Western setting of politics?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I mentioned briefly that, you know, this whole idea of what the state has to do and, you know, what society has to do is kind of an idealized version of what we usually have as a Western state. So depending on what role the state has and the relationship of the state to the private sector, you know, also how much of the critical infrastructures are privatized or liberalized, these questions do tend to be really different or can be answered differently. So we need to be aware that we need to be very careful in knowing the different, you know, historical but also actual roles and power relationships. So is there even a possibility of this social contract to work in a given society? Can there be trust, you know, that the government actually uses its powers in a way to give security, or has that never happened? That will obviously change the relationships between different actors and will also make different strategies important, or how forcefully, you know, we need to engage with certain aspects and not others.
And the last question that I received is, how would we envision decentralization of action, power, and decision, but beyond the current cryptocurrency debate?
Oh. I can't answer that. That's too specific, especially not in the time that we still have, like 60 seconds left.
Fair enough. And with that, Miriam, let me thank you for taking the time today for this webinar. This was really excellent. And thank you all for joining. For those of you who participated in the first two webinars, you will have noticed that we made a few changes compared to the first webinar, which is based on the feedback that you submitted after the last two webinars. So we're continuously trying to improve the webinar and to make sure that it meets your needs. So please take a minute after you sign off to fill out the survey that will pop up as soon as you exit the webinar. And with that, we hope to welcome you to the next webinar, which will focus on cybercrime. And you will find more information about the next webinar, as well as the recordings and literature for the preceding 3 webinars on the website that you can find in the chat. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a nice day.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.